Good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year to everybody. I hope all have been keeping well and managed to get a reasonable break over the Christmas period. I think Jo is online in the background, and she says a very Happy New Year to everyone who's connected with Base, and obviously from Flightpad, from myself, Andy Perkins. It's a real pleasure to have you online this evening with us. So thank you for taking the time out of your schedule, and hopefully it'll be a useful session. So what we're going to do is as sort of a little preamble, just so you know sort of who we are and the purpose of this, we're going to look at selection methods today. And before we go into the presentation and sort of run through that, this is all about yourselves. I want you to get as much out of this sort of 30 to 45 minutes as we can. And to that end, we've really asked you to try and engage with the chat function. So please feel free to put any comments on there and any questions. And I'd really like us to try and evolve the conversation as we talk to make sure it's relevant to the individual needs of those on the call. So without further ado, we'll get started. So I think Jo is just going to pop up the presentation. So what we've been trying to look at here is a little series of how to become the pilot. There was a little glitch there. Jo, if you want to send me a text just to let me know that we're back online, that would be great. And great. So how to become the pilot everyone wants to employ. The intent of this is to have a series of 7 presentations that you can dip in and out of as you feel is appropriate for yourselves. But importantly, is to try and give you a background as to what you can do over the next sort of 3 to 6 months in particular to make sure that as the rebound in the industry and the world occurs, you're able to capitalize on that and put yourself at the forefront for any roles. In terms of my background, I'm CEO of Flightpad and also a company called Turnpoint. And what we do there is we specialize in helping people with their training requirements. As part of that, the other thing that I also do is work for British Airways, and I spent a number of years helping with their recruitment processes, specifically around the pilot recruitment side of things. So what we wanted to look at today, if we move on to the next slide, please, Jo, is to run through some of the elements of selection methods. Jo, are you able to pop the next slide up, please? Okay, well, whilst we're waiting for that slide to appear, I'm hoping that people can hear us. Let's hope if people want to put something in there to let me know that I'm not just talking to myself, that would be very helpful. In terms of the selection methods, the 3 things we're going to look at is why do companies bother? What do they measure? And how you as a pilot can prepare for those to make sure that you give the right impression and get the right information when you end up attending any of the different elements. Jo, could you just move the slide on? I'm still on the first slide. Just wonder if we could move forward to the one that says our talk today. But in terms of, okay, I can't see that slide, but I can carry on regardless, because actually it's the content that's the important bit. So first of all, why do companies bother? You might think this is sort of a bit of a crazy sort of thing to sort of ask, but the important bit here is to look at the detail of actually what are companies trying to get out of this. Well, they obviously want to minimize their exposure to risk. The majority of pilots that join, particularly the big airlines, tend to stay and have a fairly extensive career with them mainly due to the sort of the pay structures favouring people staying for the long term. Also, the amount of money that they will invest in you as a trainee of any form, even if you're experienced, is they will be really keen to try and make sure that they get the most out of you as an individual in terms of a financial return. Now, in terms of what that looks like, is that a typical sort of type course, as you know, is in the order of £30,000, and that's before you actually do any of the line training associated, and easily you go up to around £50,000 if you factor in the other training costs that are incurred. So as a result of that, they want to make sure that they choose the right people in terms of the technical side, that are going to cause them the minimum amount of training footprint. And in addition to that, the other thing that they'll be looking to do is to make sure that you're a good fit for their company. Now, as I'm sure you're aware, there are many different ways of actually doing that selection, and we'll come on to those later in terms of how to prepare and what the companies measure. But in general, the main thing that they're looking for is to check your person, make sure as a person you've got the integrity and honesty, and as well as the technical abilities. And as part of that, they're then going to spend time making sure that you are that fit and that you have the very diverse skill set that you now need as an airline pilot of today. Because as I'm sure most of you know, what people are looking for today is not just somebody to actually technically operate an aircraft, but someone who's able to engage with the customers across the whole of the spectrum of the business to make sure that they give the detail to the customer base and ensure people return and fly with them more regularly. So in terms of what they measure, there's obviously lots of different ways that different things that people can use in their selection processes. Now, the first bit is obviously the application form. And a lot of people think that the application form with a CV and cover letter is sort of just getting your foot in the door. Well, actually, that foot in the door can actually be obviously really crucial in terms of how you put it across. There's been some separate talks on CV writing that you can also find on the FlightPad membership site, totally free. So if you haven't looked at that and you need to update your CV or your cover letter techniques, we've got Tina Kanacha, who has worked extensively in aviation as well as other transport industries, helping people with their selection. And as a result of that, what you can do is have a look and see how to make sure that your CV is appropriate to the role that you're going for. Now, in terms of that initial sort of piece, in terms of what they're looking for, they're obviously looking for your skills in terms of the CV, but they also want to know more about you as an individual. What makes you stand out compared to the crowd? Because if at the end of the day, let's say there's 10 people, and I think we're going to come into a period later this year into next where there's going to be a lot of highly qualified pilots available, and people will be looking to select the ones that stand out. So the ones that have got those extra skills in terms of the way they engage with people, the way that they excuse me, conduct themselves in terms of safety critical natures sort of topics. And importantly, what have you done in the last year to make sure that you develop and enhance your skill set? So what are you doing to keep yourself current, even if you're not flying very much at the moment? On that one, if you've got any thoughts of things you have been doing, it would be really good if you could put those in the chat function. It would just be really interesting to discuss those. And excuse me, discuss those later on. So in terms of what else they measure, once we've done the initial CV and cover letter, one of the other things that we'll then look at is potentially aptitude testing. Now, aptitude testing can take many forms, from a technical one through to, sorry, my voice has just suddenly started going, through to capacity and personality questionnaires. Now, those different tests will look at a whole multitude of different things. But one of the things that they're really looking to measure is how you cope under pressure and how you maybe persevere when you suddenly develop a cough on a conference call and on a webinar, and how you maybe push on through that to make sure you try and deliver the same standard regardless of other factors. So they're going to take different forms, and we'll talk about how you can prepare for those when we move on to some of the slides later on. The crucial bit with all of those, and again, why are they bothering to measure that? Well, actually, there's some direct links that can be made between some of the tests and your success in a type rating conversion course and further on in your training online in the company. When we were using them, we had some very reliable capacity tests in particular, which were really useful for judging the ability of the person going through to be successful as a type rating conversion course. Now, a lot of that is about your ability to cope under pressure with multiple tasks and how you fare in those areas. A certain amount of that can be learned, and experience really helps in terms of managing yourself and making sure that you have effective methods of controlling your workload at times of high stress. And again, that's something we can talk about in a different webinar. But I think the other thing that is sometimes overlooked is that in those selection processes where we're looking at the aptitude tests, things such as verbal reasoning are really useful and relevant, because actually what they do is they talk you through or give the selection team a slightly different slant in terms of what you're able to achieve in terms of interpretation of text. Now, what is really important there is, as we know, there's an awful lot of regulation in our industry, and being able to interpret different forms of text and being able to draw the right conclusions is a really important thing that we want people to be able to achieve and do on a regular basis. So that's one of the things that those tests and sort of technical selection are really looking for. Joe, if we can try moving on the slides again and just see if they work, that would be good. At the moment, it's still showing me on the original slide. Perhaps that's my screen pausing, and if it is, what we'll maybe do is move down to what do companies measure in selection, and then we'll go on to how to prepare in a moment. So in terms of what other things companies measure, obviously all of you will probably be very up to date with interviews, and the important thing with the interview is that actually they're not just looking for your skill sets, they're looking for everything about you as a person. So what motivates you to join the company in question, and what are you going to do to help further that company in terms of making a difference and helping them achieve the profits that they want as a company. Now, things that would really be helpful there are often examples, they're often competency based. So they'll look at, when have you done something? And people will ask, can you give me an example of when? And actually it's quite easy to look through your past and have a look at lots of different examples that would maybe be relevant for when you've maybe coped under pressure, when you've maybe gone the extra mile to help another colleague or a customer. And if you start looking through those examples, you'll see they fall into about 7 or 8 categories. Now, there's lots of information online to give you a bit of a detailed background to the interview, so I'm not going to go into too much depth there. But what I wanted to sort of highlight is that the vast majority of airlines are really looking for that key motivation of why you want to join that airline. And the reason for that is that what they really want to see is how, as an individual, you sort of really go that extra mile. Because at the end of the day, if your motivation is really strong, then that's great. Because at the end of the day, you should be, as I remember one CEO telling me once, says that people are normally the happiest the day they join and the most enthusiastic, and then they have a bit of a lull, and then the most enthusiastic and passionate point again is on the day they leave. So if you take most pilots joining an airline and hanging there for the best part of 20 to 30 years, that gives you a period in the middle where you've got to hope you've made a really good selection at the beginning to make sure that that person develops as an individual within the company. And regardless of any issues that sort of may occur and different changes to working conditions that might occur over a period of up to 20 or 25 years or more, that they're still going to be a loyal person and work hard for your company to make the profits that you require. So that sort of gives you hopefully a bit of an idea behind the scenes as to what companies are trying to measure in selection and why. I suppose before I move on to the sort of how to prepare, I think the last bit that we obviously see in a lot of pilot interview and selection is the use of the simulator. A lot of people sort of ask, well, what in particular sort of really comes about and why does a company do that? It's normally just a confidence check, because by that point we tend to have already worked out whether you're the kind of person we want to be part of the company or not. So actually the simulator is an opportunity for you to enter a familiar working environment and to perform your duties in a normal way that enables the interview and selection process team to actually look at you as an individual and say, has everything we've seen so far, does that actually play out when he or she is in the real environment in the flight deck? And actually that makes a huge difference to how people react, because you do sometimes see people put on a really good show at the sort of selection days where they'll do great things in the aptitude tests. They'll go through and do really well on an interview on a one-to-one basis. But when they're under pressure in the simulator, you sometimes see some of the things that they've discussed as being sort of real traits that they're very good at, they may become uncovered in the simulator and maybe make you sort of reassess and change your opinion as to whether that person's suitable for your company. So if we move on to the slide of how to prepare now. So there's several things that I would recommend with regard to a whole selection process. Practice, research, and sleep. So we'll take those in turns. So practice. What I imagine the questions are now going to say, and I must admit, I don't know whether my questions or comments are sort of delayed or not, but what I would say is please do put any comments in the chat and I'll try and add those in. Because one of the things, what do you do to practice? So let's start with the interview. So I think the best way to prepare for the interview is first of all to write down what you think the typical questions are going to be. Write out using the STAR technique. So if you're unfamiliar with the STAR technique, that's situation, task, actions, and review or results, depending on how the situation is set. And what that does is that gives you an opportunity to break down your examples in a structured manner that are really easy to then put across depending on what question you receive at interview. Now you may think, well, okay, so I've written those down. Well, actually practice them. Get someone to interrogate you slightly and to ask you those questions in a slightly formal setting. So it may seem bizarre, but I actually think getting yourself in the role, getting the suit on, getting the tie done up, or getting a suitable, smart, formal dress on of some form, turning up into either your living room or your kitchen and having an interview with somebody you know is actually probably even more difficult than doing it with somebody else. Things to remember, most interview processes, the first question they'll ask is to something to relax you. So it's be like, why do you want to do this job? Or what has your journey today been like to get here? What do you think of what is going on outside at the moment in terms of the world? They're just going to do something to try and relax you into the interview before going into the usual sort of process where they're looking at your leadership skills, they're looking at your workload management, and they're working through all those different pilot competencies that are now part of EBT training. And ICAO have obviously published those, I think, 8 or 9 different competencies about your technical training, your non-technical training, any of your situational awareness. And in effect, most interview selection processes will run through those different elements as part of their sort of questioning. So that would be the first bit in terms of the interview. Now, in terms of thinking through what we could do in terms of any sort of personality questionnaires. So the personality questionnaires have now been brought in under CAP 1938, and also there is an EASA CAT Gen MPA 175B, which I had to look up. I don't remember that one off the top of my head, and they are the latest requirements in terms of personality that people have to now assess when people join a company, and there will be a period as well where they have to undertake that kind of testing of their existing employees. And this is all to do to make sure that your well-being is of the right standard, to make sure that you, in terms of mental health, you're well and don't pose a risk to yourself or others. So that's one element that will now become compulsory throughout most selection processes. So expect to see things related to personality over the coming months and years. When it comes on to the more technical sort of questions in terms of aptitude tests, so ones where they're testing your capacity or your mental arithmetic, the mental arithmetic side, if I can take that one first, that is something that most of us tend not to use on a daily basis anymore. Yes, we might use the 3 times table to calculate a lot of our descents, but we do a lot of that just through experience. One of the things that I have found always works really well is to use some of the sort of early learning books that are age specific, anywhere between 8 and 12-year-olds, which are looking at mental arithmetic in terms of quick fire. They can be really helpful. Sounds bizarre. The ones that I found were really good were called a 30-second challenge, and they were fantastic. And what they enabled me to do was just do a lot of mental arithmetic in a short period of time to get myself back up to speed. And I'd recommend, if you haven't done much mental arithmetic going into these, that's a really good thing to do just to get yourself up and running again. There's obviously a lot of apps as well that you could download to that effect. I think there's one called Mathboard, which does something very similar. The other thing that you'll have seen, a lot of people will have seen, I think it's Cockpit Web and a couple of others that give you an idea about some of the capacity tests. Now, capacity is actually a very difficult thing to accurately measure. There are some really good tests out there, and I've been fortunate enough to use some of those professionally. And what I'd say is the thing to remember with a lot of those capacity tests is that they tend to build gradually up to a certain level. So what they're trying to do is they're in effect layering the pressure. Excuse me again. So if they start off with the first layer of a fairly simple task, what you might find is that you end up doing another task or multiple elements in quick succession. And some of those tests will either continue the pace and just add and add and add to see how you cope, or they will vary it depending on how well you achieve in the early stages. And certainly the ones that I've seen that have been the most useful in terms of giving realistic information are the ones that add enough pressure to put you under pressure as an individual. And what they're really testing is your endurance at that capacity. So all I'd say is if you find yourself being overwhelmed by any of those capacity tests, the important thing is to try and keep breathing, which sounds very obvious, but by thinking about your breathing, that tends to slow you down. So take it easy, slow it down, and try and prioritize the tasks. One of the things as humans that have been examined and looked at over time, and again, there's some information on the FlightPad membership area on this, is that what you can do, what they found from a study in the American Army was that most people cannot multitask effectively. But what some people are very good at is doing lots of tasks in very close order. And what you end up doing is making sure you concentrate on one thing. When you've got that under control, you do the next thing and you come back to the other. And it's about having that continuous sequence and the agility to keep going backwards and forwards and doing the same thing over and over whilst looking out for other elements going on around you. And that can be really important in terms of building up that skill set. Now, a lot of people will sort of say, well, should I go off on a course and do this? Well, some of those courses can be quite useful in terms of opening your eyes to some of the elements involved. But actually, a lot of this is about just practicing at home and getting your scan rates and things of that nature back up. So in terms of aptitude tests, if you've got access to any kind of flight simulator, just getting your scan rate back up with the basic T-scan will actually help you a lot in those aptitude tests, because most of them are about being able to scan for information whilst doing the primary task of some form of dexterity and sort of flying element. So I think doing all of those things is really important in terms of keeping yourself up to speed. You might say, well, actually, okay, how do I prepare and practice in the current environment? Well, I would say there's lots of different ways that you could do that to keep yourself current. And one of the things that I would recommend in terms of keeping your handling skills up is to actually rehearse the different things that you're doing in your mind. So, for example, a lot of people are falling down at the moment in their simulator checks, not because of actually the manual handling side of things, of the actual physical flying, but much more the procedures of what to do. And a lot of that can be rehearsed and practiced at home, even just sitting on the sofa, just spending half an hour a couple of times a week, just running through memory drills and making sure that you keep your scan flows up to date in terms of where the different systems are, and maybe running through a little scenario each week of what would you do if you had a depressurization? What would I do for an emergency ascent? What would I do for an engine failure? And just going through in slow time what you would do will help you keep on top of those. And actually, again, when we come back out of this horrific situation we find ourselves in for the industry, I think that will actually put you in a really good place to be able to turn around to someone and say, well, what have you done? And you can say, well, actually, I've spent a lot of time thinking through it and practicing my procedures and making sure I discuss with colleagues and friends other ways of doing things to make sure that I'm still relevant. So hopefully that gives you a few ideas and suggestions there. If you have any questions on those bits or any specifics on what to do and how to practice, please pop them into the questions, and we'll come to those in a couple of minutes' time. In terms of the next element there, research. One of the things that really stood out to me over the years of recruitment is some people do a lack of research. They don't do much detailed digging on the company that they're going for. Now, the bit that is really obviously tricky there is that if you find yourself being asked a question about the latest figures for the company, how much money they lost in 2020, how much they made in 2019, who are the key people, roughly how many destinations do they serve, and all of those kind of elements are really important things. And also have a little look at sort of what else they're doing as a company. How do they engage with the community? How do they make sure that their staff have got the skills and the tools that they need? Are they doing something that sort of makes them stand out from other companies in terms of the way that they approach their customers? Are they doing lots of things electronically? Having all of those elements, which are all normally available on their websites under their corporate sort of sections in terms of their social responsibilities as well as their corporate responsibilities and everything that's filed at Companies House with the annual reports, you can find a lot of information very quickly. And all I'd say is just a couple of hours spent there can really make you stand out again compared to others, because it will make you look really sharp, and you'll understand what their next agendas sort of are and their next key sort of targets in terms of the market. Now, the other thing you'll see on the slide of how to prepare is sleep. Now, this may sound very, very obvious, but one of the things is that whenever you go for any of these selection processes, your brain is working, which at least it should be, at least probably twice as hard as it does in a normal day. Certainly, whenever I go for interview, I feel as though my head is slightly on fire because it's like there is so much information being processed. Now, the brain uses a lot of energy, certainly for me. So having a really good night's sleep, making sure you're hydrated, and actually, if you know it's going to be a 3 or 4 hour process that you're going to go through in any one period, actually make sure your body has got the fuel it needs. I was advised years back to have one of those sports drinks, just as well as water, just to really help keep your glucose levels up. And actually, if you're doing any tests of any form or anything where you're requiring a lot of mental thought, they can be really useful. And it'll really help, again, make sure that you are fully prepared and show your best self when you go forward for any of the selection. I think that kind of moves me nicely on to the questions. So I can see there's one from Luke. So it said, in the past, I made a lot of climbs, rock and ice climbing in the mountains. I'm envious already. That sounds great. Do you think it might be the advantage in terms of dealing with risky situations or a disadvantage? And do I think it's worth sharing that factor in the interview? So I think it's really good. I think the important bit to emphasize there, Luke, is the discipline involved. So to become a successful rock climber, you have to consider all the different safety factors to make sure that you're safe as well as the other people that are climbing with you. To have done, even just from what you said there, where you're making lots of climbs on rock and ice, you're doing things that are really technical. They involve a lot of skill. They involve a lot of energy and a lot of forward thought. And also, you've got to have a plan in your mind of what are you going to do if a situation goes wrong. And actually, I think if it's painted in the right light, it can be one of the most sort of powerful examples that you could give, because actually what you're doing there is really highlighting how you're able to manage risk. And the fact that you have climbed so many times successfully actually highlights that you have a really good approach to risk management. And I think the important thing in terms of how you share that factor in the interview is, again, if we go back to the STAR sort of technique, is have a look at what the situation is, talk about the task in hand, excuse me again with my my throat. So think about how you prioritized and how you made sure that you managed the risk. Did you involve others in the decision-making process? What information did you gather to allow you to make that decision? And then from that, what was the outcome, and how did you manage to sort of make sure you sort of ratified those elements before you continued? And I think the last thing I'd add there is a really good thing to add in there in terms of the actions is actually remember you could also mention where you've turned around on a climb, because certainly when you look at all the great climbers of the world, the ones that have survived and the ones that are the most successful are the ones that have been able to make that decision, even when they can see the goal in sight, to turn around and back off because there was a couple of elements that they felt were too risky and were dangerous. So if you're able to identify those bits, actually, if you put that into an example, it shows how you can manage risk, shows leadership, it shows an ability and situational awareness and workload management. So all of a sudden, you're ticking loads and loads of the competency boxes. So I hope that answers that one. Jordan, how can someone improve from a pilot selection day when you don't receive feedback? Couldn't agree more. It's really difficult. In terms of the feedback loop, I remember years ago when I first went for selection at British Airways, and they said, "I'm really sorry, we don't give feedback." And I managed to find the phone number and just politely phoned a few times, and eventually somebody actually did manage to give me some feedback. So it's very lucky for me. So that's the first thing, is potentially be a little bit persistent to see if you can actually get some feedback. I think the other thing I would say in terms of those selection days is when you get home, try and break down how you think you did in certain bits. It'd be very difficult to gauge how you did in some of the tests, but what you will be able to do is almost run through what questions were asked and what answers you gave. So in that sense, you'll be able to give yourself a bit of a debrief as to how things went. The other thing there is, although it isn't obviously the same as getting feedback from the individual that sees you during the day, is to talk through those answers that you gave to the questions with somebody else that you trust or have a good rapport with, because they will be able to give you an honest feedback as to how you came across, and hopefully give you some ideas of how to fine tune and refine what you said. I think the only other thing I would say on that one, Jordan, because it is difficult, is actually have a look at what you gave as your first answer. So if your first answer was maybe, or the first question was, why do you want to join the base airlines? You might turn around and go, well, I think they've got an extensive network, and they go many places. They seem to have a nice camaraderie, and I love flying. You might be able to turn around and go, well, actually, okay, so maybe I wasn't as passionate or direct in terms of how I could influence things. So what you could do is turn around at that point and say, right, if I was to answer that question again of why I want to work for base airlines, I would, I don't know if you're thinking of setting one up, Joe, maybe that's next year. But I think the first thing I do is say, I love flying. I've always wanted to do lots of different things with my career, but most importantly, I'm hardworking. I always want to. I've got a real belief that base is going places. You've got an incredible network already in a short time that you've been around, and I'd love to be a part of that team that helps deliver further aviational opportunities across the world through base. So try and just think about how you could change the emphasis depending on the questions that you've seen. So I hope that helps and gives a bit of an idea of some of the things you can do. And again, there's lots of guidance on the Google, but also on the FlightPad website in terms of things to think about and compare ideas to try and up your game in that area. So DK, thought on switching schools mid-training and hiring companies' opinion on this. Do you know what? It really depends on quite a few different factors. I think the important bit is you've got to look at making sure that you end up having the right training that you require. So if it's something that you've required halfway through training, and there's quite a number of people I know that have changed because of factors at the flying school that they were at, where they didn't have the capacity to continue the delivery in the time period required to get the license issued. Now, that's slightly outside of your control, and actually that might be something that you want to just refer to. You may not want to highlight it, but you just maybe want to refer the reason that you changed midway through. Actually, a lot of it doesn't, it certainly in my eyes, doesn't matter. I think the important bit is that you've done it in a concerted and consistent manner. So I think if I had the choice, I'd rather see people that have maybe just been to a couple of schools as a max, and have maybe done certain modules in one place as opposed to random modules all over the place, because actually that shows there's a consistency in your training. And actually that's what the hiring company are looking for. And I think the important bit, if you've had to switch midway through your training, is to make sure that whatever bit of training you do prior, if I use the example of somebody who's gone through training but maybe is going for their first job, the last bit of training that you do, that's going to be really valuable in terms of pulling together all the training you've done. And I think what I'd want to see you highlight there is what you've done to make sure that you've consolidated all the things you've learned to that point. So just to sort of reiterate and highlight what I mean by that is, let's say you're doing your APS MCC at one location and you've done your IR and all your ground school at maybe one or two other schools. Well, actually, you turn around and go, the reason I chose to do my APS MCC here is because of the quality and fidelity of the simulator being used, and it allowed me to draw on the sort of research and knowledge that I've done over the last 18 months or 2 years, and to streamline all of those elements to allow me to consolidate those skills. And I feel I'm now fully prepared and ready for the challenge of a type rating wherever you're going. So I hope DK that sort of gives an idea as to where you stand there. And I think the last thing I say is the license is one thing. The other bit is then making sure that you stand out as an individual. And if you're able to show that you're a consistent, hard-working, learning person, that's probably going to be the crucial bit that really sets you apart from others. And the fact you had to switch midway through training won't make a difference. I'd like to apologise to everyone whilst there is a slight pause for the croaky throat that I've not had all day, but it must just be wearing a tie again. I must just have it sat in the wrong place. So my apologies for the croakiness during the presentation. I'll just leave it another minute just in case there's any other questions that pop up. If I knew how to, I would ask if Joe, is there anything else you want to say you want me to read out? If you pop that in the chat, I'll let everybody know. The intention for the next session, which is bad of me, I haven't got the date written down in front of me. But again, maybe Joe, if you have that to hand, you might be able to pop that in the chat for everyone. But our intention is that the next one will be looking at how we network and how we try and do everything. Oh, here we go. There's a good question here from Michael. I'll come back to that one in a moment. So what I'd also say is, yeah, have a good look at everything in terms of the next session. We'll try and focus on how we can improve our network and the importance of trying to keep those skills going. What we'd also request is that if there is any feedback, I'm just going to read Michael's note now. If there's any other feedback, please do let us know, because we're really happy to try and shape these sessions to make sure that they're relevant to you. Right, Michael, let's see what you've got to say. Some input. Since training, after a 7-month COVID delay, been working in Audi alongside work as an aviation lecturer. Excellent. And further, you're more using the 737 and DA42 flight sim, as well as studying the HPL theory with a group of friends to keep the IR, MCC skills and knowledge current. That is really relevant. So I think that is a great thing to do. I think as you're doing there, keeping up to date through the different networks is really, really useful. What else should you be doing? Well, to be honest, actually, I think everything you've listed there is great advice for anyone else on the call. So if you haven't highlighted that in the chat, everyone, if you have a read through what Michael has just put up there, that's a really good synopsis of things you could be doing. I think the only other bit I would suggest, Michael, is just and one of the things we're trying to set up as well through FlightPad that will sort of come online in the next couple of weeks, is to try and look at some scenarios and try and put yourself in the different position of what would you do in a pilot in-cap, what would you do for an emergency descent, what would you do if you had a hydraulic failure, and just running through one of those scenarios a week. And as you're saying, if you've got a group of friends that you can study those elements with, actually doing that and running through those different ideas is a great way of keeping yourself current and relevant. One of the things that some friends of mine have done, we've been looking at some of the historic aircraft accidents and quizzing ourselves slightly on what we think the thought processes were. I must admit the Pakistan International Airways Airbus incident of last year, I still can't work out what was going on there, but quite remarkable in terms of sort of what happened. Obviously, terrible with the loss of life, but it gives you a really good idea if you start pulling apart some of those accidents as to some of the things that could actually affect any one of us in terms of the way we operate. Also, the tragic accidents with the 737s as well, the 737 MAX in particular, and how not having a full understanding of some of the systems and how that can affect the way you do things is a really good thing to try and consider and think through. So I think there's some of the other things I'd be doing, but apart from that, I think this is going to be a long sort of challenge just to keep on top of everything as things go on. So I hope that's good, but well done, Michael, for what you're doing there. So any final questions from anybody there? Great. Well, in which case I'll say, look, thank you ever so much for listening. I really appreciate you taking the time out of the day. I do apologise yet again for the sort of croaky throat that I've ended up with, and I will go and address that very shortly. Really look forward to seeing you on the next session. And as I say, if there's any questions at all that crop up, I'm a big fan, excuse me, of trying to help everybody in the industry. I think we've all got to stick together in these difficult times. So if there is anything you want to ask, you can just send me an email, andy.perkins@flightpad.co.uk, and just feel free to post any questions either on that one or through Joe at base, and we'll do our best to answer those questions and help you on your way. But until then, enjoy the rest of the evening and look after yourselves in the current lockdown. Thank you.